The palace was silent. Not the usual ceremonial quiet, not the polite stillness that cloaks royal corridors, but a tense, brittle silence that seemed to vibrate through every marble hallway, echoing off portraits of kings and queens who had made impossible decisions before. And in that silence, one decision was about to shake the monarchy to its core. A decision that would ripple far beyond Buckingham, beyond London, and straight into the homes, hearts, and minds of people across the globe. King Charles had finally made a move that few expected, and fewer still understood fully. Meghan Markle, the former Duchess of Sussex, was about to be stripped of every single royal title she had ever held. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It sounds dramatic, perhaps too dramatic to believe, but the story behind this moment is anything but ordinary. And at its center were not just titles, crowns, or ceremonial honors, but a mother, 2 children, and a request that set the royal world ablaze. Archie and Lilibet, children whose very names have been whispered in tabloids, debated on social media, and now directly implicated in a decision that could rewrite the rules of modern monarchy. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be at the mercy of centuries-old traditions while being pulled into a media frenzy, your every move dissected, criticized, and sensationalized? Imagine trying to navigate a world where loyalty is measured in titles, influence is calculated in protocol, and a single request could threaten your legacy. That was the precarious position Meghan found herself in. The request was simple, at least in her mind: new royal titles for her children. But simple is rarely simple when it comes to the British monarchy. The stakes were enormous, the implications unprecedented. For centuries, royal titles were not merely symbolic. They were the currency of power, legacy, and hierarchy. To request new titles for Archie and Lilibet was to challenge that hierarchy, to confront tradition, and, in doing so, to provoke the ultimate reaction from the head of the monarchy, the king himself. What happened next is a story of tension, strategy, and raw emotion. It begins in private corridors where the public rarely steps, in rooms lined with history and watched over by the ghosts of monarchs past. It involves texts that were never meant to be seen, legal opinions whispered behind closed doors, and the silent calculations of a king whose patience had limits. It involves Prince William, caught between duty to his father and frustration with his brother's spouse. And it involves Meghan, whose ambitions, intentions, and fears would collide with a system designed to resist change at every turn. But before we dive into the palace intrigue, it's important to understand the players and their positions. King Charles, ascending to the throne with a lifetime of experience in royal duty, has always carried a quiet but formidable presence. He has navigated decades of public scrutiny, family tension, and political complexity. Yet even he was pushed to a breaking point. Prince William, heir apparent and protector of the royal line, had watched the Sussexes from a distance for years. He had hoped for reconciliation, for diplomacy, for compromise. But the audacity of Meghan's request, on behalf of 2 children not yet fully integrated into the royal framework, tested both his patience and his sense of duty. And then there was Meghan. Ambitious, articulate, and media-savvy, she had navigated Hollywood, philanthropy, and royal life with a flair that inspired both admiration and controversy. Her desire for new titles for Archie and Lilibet, however, was more than a simple request. It was a challenge to centuries of protocol, a demand that the monarchy adapt, and, some might say, a provocation. The backdrop to this drama is essential. The monarchy is not merely a ceremonial institution. It is a living system of rules, precedents, and unspoken codes. Each title carries history, and every adjustment can ripple through decades of royal tradition. When Meghan submitted her request, she may have imagined a discussion, perhaps negotiation. She may have expected resistance, but what she did not anticipate was the full force of the palace machinery responding in a way that would change her life forever. Now, it's easy to get lost in the headlines. Meghan stripped of titles, royal family in crisis, Archie and Lilibet controversy. But behind the headlines lies a story of human emotion, of calculated strategy, and of private conversations that would never make the papers. How did King Charles reach his decision? What role did William play? Were there leaks, miscommunications, or deliberate provocations that escalated the situation? And what does this mean for the children at the center of it all? Let's start with the immediate context. The request for new titles came at a moment of heightened sensitivity. The Sussexes were already living abroad, navigating their media presence, their Netflix contracts, and their strained relationship with the palace. Meghan's request was seen not as a personal plea, but as a strategic maneuver, one that forced King Charles to act decisively. Sources inside Buckingham suggest that the king saw the request as an affront not merely to tradition, but to the integrity of the monarchy itself. Consider this. In the history of the British monarchy, it is almost unheard of for a senior royal to have every title stripped while the head of the family is alive and reigning. Posthumous adjustments happen. Disputes over succession occasionally arise. But to act while the parties involved are active, vocal, and capable of shaping public opinion? That is revolutionary. And it is precisely what makes this story so gripping. As the news began to circulate, leaks to sympathetic journalists, whispers in the corridors of power, subtle hints in royal briefings, the reaction was electric. Public opinion was divided. Royal experts debated legality, protocol, and precedent. Social media erupted with commentary, speculation, and speculation about speculation. But inside the palace, it was far more intense. Decisions were being made, advisors consulted, and one of the most significant moves in modern royal history was unfolding in real time. And then there were the children. Archie and Lilibet were caught in the crossfire of a dispute far beyond their understanding. Their names had become symbols, their status a flashpoint, their futures entwined with the drama of adults navigating power, pride, and protocol. What was at stake was not just titles. It was identity, legacy, and the right to be recognized as part of the institution that defines their family. Yet the story is not simply about power or politics. At its core, it is deeply human. It is about a father confronting a challenge to his authority, a brother navigating loyalty and frustration, and a mother advocating for her children while navigating a world that rarely offers her grace. It is about the collision of ambition and tradition, media attention and personal privacy, love and duty. So why does this story matter now? Because the implications are immediate and long-lasting. The decision affects not just Meghan and her children, but the monarchy itself. It sets a precedent for how future disputes may be handled. It raises questions about the balance between family, tradition, and modernity. And it asks the audience, us, to consider what it means when history, protocol, and personal ambition collide in the glare of public attention. The opening chapter of this saga ends not with closure, but with a question that will drive this entire story. What happens when a royal demand challenges centuries of tradition, and the king says no? What comes next is a series of decisions, reactions, and revelations that escalate in intensity, each more dramatic than the last. And one thing is certain. No one will emerge from this unscathed. But what Meghan did next would shock the palace to its core and set the stage for an unprecedented royal showdown. The questions are many. How did King Charles respond immediately? What role did Prince William play behind the scenes? How did the legal advisors, courtiers, and even intelligence services react to this audacious request? And most importantly, what does this mean for Archie and Lilibet, whose lives have been irrevocably changed before they have even begun to understand the weight of royal legacy? No one expected Meghan Markle to ask for this. Not the king, not the courtiers, not even the palace advisors who had grown accustomed to navigating the unpredictable path of the Sussexes' decisions. And yet, there it was, a formal request for new royal titles for Archie and Lilibet. On paper, it was straightforward. In reality, it was nothing short of seismic. Imagine the scene. A quiet afternoon at Buckingham Palace, King Charles reviewing daily correspondence, a ceremonial calm masking the high-stakes decisions being considered behind closed doors. The request arrived through the usual channels, but its contents were anything but ordinary. A mother asking the reigning monarch to bestow unprecedented titles upon her children, children who were technically outside the core line of succession, was a bold move. Audacious, some might say reckless. The palace had seen requests before, petitions for honors, suggestions for charity involvement, or discreet attempts to influence public appearances. But this was different. Titles are not mere labels. They are the threads that weave the fabric of monarchy, defining hierarchy, privilege, and lineage. For Meghan to request new titles for Archie and Lilibet was, in effect, to challenge centuries of tradition. And King Charles, ever mindful of the monarchy's integrity, recognized this immediately. Sources inside the palace described the moment the letter was read as tense, almost electric. Courtiers reportedly held their breath. Royal aides whispered behind hands. Charles, however, maintained his composure, at least outwardly. But insiders say his mind raced. The implications were clear. Granting the request would set a precedent that could affect every member of the royal family for generations. Denying it, however, risked public backlash, media outrage, and a personal rift that might never heal. What Meghan may not have anticipated was just how carefully calculated the monarchy's response would be. This was not a simple rejection. It would be an orchestrated, strategic, and deliberate act, designed to maintain authority, protect tradition, and send a message without causing irreparable public scandal. And yet, the palace also had to consider the human element. These were children, after all, children who had done nothing wrong, whose names had been thrust into headlines and public debates before they had a chance to understand their own place in the world. The request itself was remarkable not just for its content, but for its timing. The Sussexes were living abroad, operating independently from the crown, producing media content, and navigating a life that was increasingly removed from traditional royal duties. Some insiders interpreted the request as a subtle power play, a way for Meghan to assert influence over the institution she had left but remained entangled with. Others viewed it as a maternal plea, an earnest effort to secure recognition and protection for her children. Perhaps it was a little of both. King Charles convened a discreet meeting immediately after receiving the letter. Those invited were among the most trusted advisors, legal minds, and senior courtiers, including Prince William, who had long played a role as mediator, protector, and enforcer of royal protocol. The discussion, sources say, was tense from the start. Arguments were made about precedent. Counterarguments highlighted the risks of granting the request. And through it all, the question lingered. How could the monarchy reconcile tradition with the reality of a modern, media-driven family? It is worth pausing to understand why the request was so controversial. In the British royal system, titles are carefully controlled. They signify rank, inheritance, and the family's historical narrative. Granting new titles to individuals outside the immediate line of succession is rare and often comes with significant debate. To do so for Archie and Lilibet would require bending rules, reshaping precedent, and potentially angering other branches of the family who had long expected a clear, orderly hierarchy. For Meghan, the request may have seemed like a natural extension of her role as a mother advocating for her children. After all, parents do everything in their power to secure their children's future. But in this case, the future in question was entwined with centuries of royal protocol, centuries of expectations, and a global audience scrutinizing every move. The stakes could not have been higher. As the palace deliberated, the situation grew even more complex. Prince William, caught between loyalty to his father and his understanding of his brother's family, voiced concerns. He reportedly argued that the request, if granted, would undermine the structure of the monarchy. Others countered, noting that denying the request could provoke Meghan into public statements, media leaks, or legal challenges. The tension was palpable. Every word, every gesture, every nuance was analyzed. Meanwhile, Meghan's team outside the palace prepared for what they believed could be a positive outcome. Lawyers drafted supporting documents, communication strategists advised on public perception, and allies in the media were subtly nudged to prepare stories framing the request as reasonable and just. They were confident, some might say overconfident, that the monarchy would consider the request with empathy and fairness. But the palace does not operate on assumptions. It operates on protocol, authority, and historical precedent. King Charles, acutely aware of both the personal and institutional stakes, knew that any decision would be scrutinized, dissected, and debated endlessly. It was not just about titles. It was about maintaining the monarchy's credibility, safeguarding the family legacy, and asserting that no individual, regardless of media influence or public pressure, could override centuries of tradition. Then came the moment that would set the entire chain of events into motion. Charles, with his advisors, began drafting the palace's response. The tone was firm but measured, strategic but unmistakable. It would signal to Meghan, to the public, and to the world that the monarchy remained sovereign, unyielding, and deeply protective of its structure. Yet, even as the decision took shape, the human element remained undeniable. The children were at the center, and their well-being had to be considered, if only for optics, if nothing else. It was at this point that the palace received another layer of complication. A message from Meghan herself, less formal, more personal, but no less consequential, arrived via encrypted channels. The content was emotional, persuasive, and insistent. She appealed to Charles as a father, as a grandfather, as a custodian of history. She reminded him of the values he had long championed: fairness, compassion, and respect. She framed the request as a moral imperative rather than a procedural anomaly. The palace reaction was mixed. Some advisors were moved, others alarmed. Some saw it as a potential softening of Charles's resolve, while others interpreted it as a calculated attempt to manipulate sentiment. The king himself read the message in silence, his expression unreadable. Behind the composure, however, was calculation. Charles had navigated difficult family dynamics before: his own mother, his siblings, decades of public scrutiny, and he was not about to let precedent be broken lightly. As the day progressed, the tension mounted. Courtiers moved quietly, observers whispered, and security personnel maintained discreet vigilance. Every action, every email, every informal discussion had the potential to influence the outcome. And outside, the media began picking up on subtle leaks, enough to suggest that something significant was unfolding, but not enough to reveal the full story. The palace was alive with anticipation, strategy, and unspoken stakes. The request had achieved exactly what it was designed to do. It forced the monarchy to act, and act decisively. But the palace also knew that whatever decision was made, the story would not end quietly. Meghan had allies, platforms, and public influence. The world was watching. Social media would dissect every detail. Historians would debate legality and precedent. The royal family would be tested in ways few had anticipated. And yet, despite all the pressure, King Charles made his choice. But not before a final consultation, an internal discussion with Prince William, a weighing of personal loyalty against institutional responsibility, a silent negotiation with his own conscience. Every option carried risk. Every path had consequences. And in the end, one path emerged as inevitable. The path that would lead to a decision no one had seen coming, and a response that would ripple through history. The grand halls of Buckingham Palace are accustomed to ceremonial pomp, tourist photographs, and the careful choreography of royal appearances. But behind the gilded doors, in rooms never photographed, never filmed, the true workings of the monarchy unfold. It is here, in private chambers, that history is made, decisions are forged, and alliances tested. And it was behind these palace doors that one of the most consequential discussions in recent royal history was about to take place. The moment King Charles received Meghan Markle's request for new titles for Archie and Lilibet, he convened an emergency meeting. The attendees were a carefully curated selection: senior advisors, legal experts, a few trusted courtiers, and, critically, Prince William. The stakes were clear. The request challenged centuries of tradition, risked igniting public and media scrutiny, and, most importantly, touched on the personal lives of family members in ways that no official document could fully anticipate. As the meeting began, the air was thick with tension. Every participant understood that this was not just a policy discussion. It was a confrontation with history, precedent, and personal emotion. Courtiers whispered in corners. Legal documents were shuffled across desks. Advisors spoke in measured tones, careful not to reveal personal opinions too strongly. And at the center of it all sat King Charles, composed yet alert, the weight of his office evident in every movement. Prince William was visibly tense. He had long maintained a careful balance between supporting his brother and upholding the integrity of the monarchy. Now, that balance was under strain. He knew the implications of granting the titles. It could create a ripple effect across the family, upsetting expectations and hierarchy. But he also understood the potential fallout from denying the request outright: public criticism, media storms, and perhaps irreparable damage to his brother's family. The discussion opened with legal considerations. Royal titles are not simply ceremonial. They are codified in law, bound by precedent, and interwoven with centuries of history. The legal advisors meticulously outlined the consequences of granting new titles. Each scenario was weighed: potential lawsuits, challenges from other family members, and the broader constitutional implications. The weight of centuries pressed heavily on the room, as advisors reminded each other that every decision would be scrutinized, debated, and remembered. Yet alongside the legal arguments were emotional considerations. Several courtiers quietly reminded the king of the children involved. Archie and Lilibet, though young, were central to the discussion. The argument was made that decisions should balance tradition with compassion, that even in a monarchy steeped in protocol, the human element could not be ignored. King Charles listened intently, absorbing both logic and sentiment. His reputation as a thoughtful and empathetic monarch would be tested here in real time. As the debate intensified, Prince William took a more direct role. His voice, calm but firm, outlined the dangers of yielding to the request. "Once we set this precedent," he reportedly said, "there is no going back. Titles are not just symbolic. They define the hierarchy, the family line, and the expectations for every royal generation to come. This is not a personal judgment. It's the institution we must protect." Other advisors pushed back, noting that the monarchy had survived controversies before. They argued that denying the request without consideration could provoke Meghan into public statements, media campaigns, or even legal action that could undermine the crown. Some suggested a compromise, though no one could define exactly what that would look like. The tension in the room grew with every passing minute, a delicate dance of protocol, loyalty, and strategy. Behind the closed doors, subtle gestures spoke volumes. A raised eyebrow from one advisor, a pause before replying from another. Every movement was interpreted, analyzed, and weighed. The palace is an institution where silence often speaks louder than words, and in this room, silence carried a charge of anticipation and unease. Meanwhile, Meghan's request had not only challenged tradition, it had tested relationships. William and Charles shared a quiet but intense exchange, weighing familial loyalty against institutional duty. Their relationship had always been strong, built on shared responsibility and mutual respect, but now it faced strain. William knew that any perceived leniency could undermine both the monarchy and his father's authority. Conversely, strict adherence could inflame tensions with his brother and sister-in-law, who were increasingly adept at wielding media influence. During the deliberations, legal documents were reviewed once more. Historical precedents were cited, instances where titles had been granted or withheld, subtle nuances in law that could be leveraged, and potential pitfalls of each choice. The discussion was exhaustive, every detail examined, every implication anticipated. This was not simply a matter of words on paper. It was a decision that would echo for generations. The atmosphere in the room was punctuated by moments of quiet reflection. King Charles, often reserved in public, allowed himself brief pauses to consider the emotional and political ramifications. He understood that this was not merely a question of titles, but of legacy, of loyalty, of what it meant to lead a family and an institution under unprecedented scrutiny. The decision he faced was as personal as it was institutional. Yet even as deliberations continued, the palace hierarchy remained acutely aware of external pressures. The media was restless, rumors already circulating in whispers. Allies of the Sussexes were ready to frame the request as a reasonable, humane plea. Opponents would call any denial a betrayal of familial compassion. Every angle, every scenario, every potential outcome was being considered simultaneously. The stakes could not have been higher. In this tense environment, King Charles finally made a subtle but significant move. He asked for further input from a small, trusted circle, emphasizing both legal considerations and the potential personal impact on the children. William was brought into these discussions in close quarters, creating a rare moment of father-son collaboration aligned on both strategy and principle. Yet even with alignment, questions remained. How would Meghan respond? How would the public react? And how would history remember this moment? By the end of the day, a consensus began to form. The decision would need to be firm, decisive, and strategically communicated. It would protect tradition while acknowledging, as best as possible, the human and familial elements. Every advisor understood the delicate balance, the razor-thin line between upholding protocol and provoking scandal. And then came the final layer of complication. A message from Meghan herself, more personal than any document, more urgent than any legal argument. It was an appeal to Charles not just as king, but as a father, as a grandfather, as a custodian of history. She framed her request in terms of fairness, love, and morality. She reminded him that children were at stake. The room fell silent as advisors absorbed the message, aware that it carried both emotional weight and strategic implications. Charles read the note carefully, measuring tone, intention, and implication. His face remained calm, but those present could sense the wheels turning behind his eyes. The palace had seen challenges before, but few combined audacity, public influence, and personal appeal as seamlessly as this. Every word, every phrase, every subtle plea was analyzed for its potential impact. The deliberations extended late into the evening, marked by careful discussion, strategic silence, and careful weighing of every possible outcome. Every scenario was examined, every risk measured. The gravity of the moment was not lost on anyone present. In that room, behind palace doors, history was quietly being written. And just as the meeting seemed to reach a critical juncture, an unexpected development arrived. Something that no advisor had anticipated, something that would push the situation toward its breaking point. A single revelation, subtle but powerful, changed the tone of the entire discussion. Sources indicate that it was a piece of information that, once considered, made the decision almost inevitable, but also made its consequences far more dramatic than anyone could have predicted. And in that quiet, tension-filled room, King Charles prepared to make a move that would not only define his reign, but would also forever alter the lives of Meghan, Archie, and Lilibet. The palace had deliberated, strategized, and anticipated every outcome, but nothing could fully prepare them, or the public, for what was coming next. Imagine opening a document and realizing that every word could change the course of history. That was exactly the feeling in the palace when King Charles and his legal advisors first reviewed the potential implications of Meghan Markle's request for new titles for Archie and Lilibet. On the surface, it seemed simple, a mother advocating for her children. But beneath that request lay a tangled web of law, precedent, and constitutional nuance that could shake the monarchy to its very foundations. Royal titles are not granted lightly. They are governed by centuries of tradition, codified in law, and carefully preserved to maintain the hierarchy, structure, and continuity of the monarchy. Each title carries weight, symbolizing not only rank and privilege but also inheritance, lineage, and responsibility. To alter this system, even slightly, is to challenge the very rules that have defined royalty for generations. Legal experts inside Buckingham Palace quickly identified a number of unprecedented factors. First, Archie and Lilibet were not only living abroad, but also operating in a semi-independent capacity, largely outside the formal duties and structures of the royal family. Second, Meghan's request explicitly sought titles that had never been granted to children in similar circumstances, pushing boundaries that had been respected for centuries. And third, there was the potential for public and media scrutiny that could complicate any legal decision, turning what might have been a private matter into a global spectacle. The legal team outlined the consequences in painstaking detail. Granting the titles could invite challenges from other family members who might argue that protocol was being bypassed. It could also set a precedent, opening the door for future claims from other royals or even distant relatives. Legal scholars were consulted to examine historical instances, searching for precedents that might justify the request. What they found were scattered examples, isolated cases that offered partial guidance, but no clear roadmap. The result was a legal quagmire, a situation where every option carried risk. But denying the request outright was not risk-free either. The palace understood that Meghan was media-savvy, well-connected, and capable of shaping public perception. A rejection could provoke leaks, public statements, or even legal action that could portray the monarchy as rigid, unempathetic, or punitive. In other words, any decision could have profound legal and reputational consequences. As the discussion unfolded, advisors considered multiple scenarios. They analyzed every angle: legal challenges, historical precedent, public perception, and internal family dynamics. Each scenario was ranked according to potential impact, probability, and risk. For hours, the palace legal team debated, recalculated, and revised their conclusions, aware that a single misstep could ignite a storm that would be impossible to control. One particularly thorny question emerged. Did Meghan have any legal basis for requesting new titles? The answer, according to legal experts, was nuanced. While she had the right to petition the king, the monarchy's structure afforded the sovereign absolute discretion over titles. Unlike other legal systems where courts could mandate recognition or confer rights, in the monarchy, the king's word was effectively law. Yet, this discretion came with caveats. Any decision could still be challenged publicly, morally, or reputationally, forcing the palace to defend both procedure and perception simultaneously. The advisors also examined historical cases, including distant precedents where children of royal marriages had been granted or denied titles under exceptional circumstances. These examples were fragmented and inconsistent, offering guidance but not certainty. Some argued that the monarchy had flexibility, particularly in modern times, to adapt to new realities. Others insisted that bending tradition even slightly could unravel decades of carefully maintained hierarchy, leading to confusion, resentment, and internal conflict. Prince William's presence during these discussions was critical. As the future king, he understood both the legal nuances and the symbolic weight of the decision. He repeatedly emphasized the importance of upholding precedent, arguing that the monarchy's legitimacy relied on clarity, consistency, and respect for historical protocols. This isn't about personal feelings, he reportedly said. It's about maintaining the institution for the generations that follow. At the same time, emotional arguments continued to surface. Some advisors reminded the king that children were at stake. Archie and Lilibet were innocent bystanders in a dispute created by adult ambitions, family dynamics, and media scrutiny. Denying the request could have lasting emotional consequences for the children and their parents. The legal team had to balance the letter of the law with the human realities of family, emotion, and public perception. The tension in the room grew when another factor was introduced: media strategy. Meghan's team had already begun preparing narratives framing the request as fair, compassionate, and reasonable. If the palace appeared unyielding, it could trigger a media storm of unprecedented scale. Legal advisors emphasized that the court of public opinion, while not legally binding, was a force capable of shaping political and institutional decisions. Every word of the legal response had to be meticulously crafted to withstand scrutiny both inside and outside the palace walls. As the discussions continued, a subtle but powerful realization emerged. The request was not merely a legal issue. It was a political, familial, and reputational challenge all rolled into one. The king, advisors, and courtiers recognized that any action would resonate far beyond the palace, influencing not only public perception of the monarchy, but also internal family relations, historical legacy, and even international diplomacy. And then came the most explosive revelation. During a confidential consultation, it was discovered that certain legal interpretations could be leveraged to justify a complete revocation of titles, not just a denial of new ones, but the removal of existing ones. This possibility was unprecedented, practically unthinkable, and yet entirely within the king's authority. The room went silent as advisors absorbed the implications. If executed, this move would be a historical first. A reigning monarch stripping a senior royal of every title previously held. Prince William reportedly leaned back, his face unreadable, considering the gravity of the decision. Legal advisors debated whether this action could withstand scrutiny, both historically and publicly. Could it be justified as a response to procedural overreach, as protection of tradition, or would it inevitably spark controversy, casting the monarchy as harsh, punitive, and unyielding? The discussion stretched on, with no easy answers. Meanwhile, the emotional stakes remained high. Charles understood that executing such a move would affect not only Meghan but also her children, his own grandson Archie, and great-granddaughter Lilibet. The king had to weigh the long-term institutional benefits against the immediate familial fallout. He had spent decades preparing for challenges of this magnitude, but rarely had the stakes combined legal, familial, and public pressures in such an intense, unprecedented way. Hours passed. Scenarios were debated. Legal memos were reviewed, revised, and debated again. Advisors considered every possible repercussion, from public backlash to internal family divisions to media exploitation. And through it all, one thing became clear. The decision would be decisive, irreversible, and historic. Finally, after exhaustive deliberation, King Charles reached a conclusion. The legal pathway had been identified. The precedent, while unconventional, was defensible. The communication strategy had been crafted to balance firmness with diplomacy, and the palace was ready to act. Yet even as the decision was finalized, one question loomed large. How would Meghan respond? Her influence, media acumen, and global platform made any reaction unpredictable. The palace knew that once the action was taken, it could never be undone, and the fallout would be immediate, intense, and unavoidable. And just as the decision was about to be formally communicated, a subtle but critical last-minute factor emerged, something that would influence timing, messaging, and strategy. A piece of intelligence, a private message, or perhaps a behind-the-scenes leak, details remained closely guarded, suddenly required the palace to adjust its plan. Every advisor realized that the stakes had escalated further, making the impending action not only historic but also fraught with unprecedented complexity. The stage was set. The legal groundwork had been laid. The communication strategy was ready. The emotional and political stakes were clearer than ever. And in that quiet, tension-filled room, King Charles prepared to take a step that no modern monarch had ever taken. A step that would forever alter the status of Meghan Markle and her children within the royal family. Anger. It is a word rarely associated with the measured, controlled world of Buckingham Palace. Yet on this day, it coursed quietly but powerfully through Prince William. He had watched the unfolding drama from the periphery for years, first with polite restraint, then with frustration, and now, with barely contained fury. Meghan Markle's audacious request for new titles for Archie and Lilibet was more than a challenge to protocol. It was, in his eyes, a challenge to the very authority of his father and the institution he was destined to inherit. The request had arrived like a spark in dry tinder, and the palace had been quietly bracing for its consequences. But William, who often served as the mediator between his father's careful deliberation and the impulsive tendencies of the Sussexes, saw something deeper. A deliberate provocation, a calculated move designed to test boundaries, sway opinion, and assert influence. It began in the private corridors of Buckingham Palace, where William paced back and forth, speaking in hushed tones with senior advisors. His voice, usually calm and diplomatic, carried an edge that made even seasoned courtiers pause. "This is more than a title request," he said. "It's a challenge to the monarchy itself. If we don't act decisively, we risk undermining everything our family stands for." Every word he spoke was weighed, every gesture calculated. William's fury was not personal, it was institutional. He understood the implications. Granting Meghan's request could destabilize the carefully maintained hierarchy, blur lines of succession, and create a precedent that might haunt future generations of royals. He was angry not just for himself, but for the institution, for his father, and for the children whose place in the royal lineage he feared could be compromised by this audacious move. William's strategy was clear. He would act swiftly, decisively, and with authority. But first, he needed to ensure alignment with King Charles. Father and son convened in a private chamber, far removed from advisors and courtiers, to discuss the potential course of action. The conversation, sources say, was intense. William expressed his concerns in no uncertain terms, emphasizing the risk of granting titles, the potential for public scandal, and the precedent it could set for the future. Charles, ever measured but deeply attentive, listened carefully. He understood both the institutional risk and the personal dynamic at play. The bond between father and son had always been strong, built on trust, mutual respect, and a shared understanding of duty. Yet now, the stakes had escalated to unprecedented levels. Any misstep could have far-reaching consequences, not only for the monarchy, but also for the fragile threads of family loyalty. As the discussion progressed, William proposed a bold course of action. If the palace were to assert authority and uphold tradition, it could not simply deny the request. It had to demonstrate control, decisiveness, and an unassailable commitment to protocol. The alternative, he argued, would be a slow erosion of authority, a gradual undermining of the monarchy's credibility, and a dangerous emboldening of external influences. The proposal was audacious, a full-scale response that would not merely reject Meghan's request, but assert the monarchy's dominance over titles, tradition, and family hierarchy. It was a move calculated to send a clear message to Meghan, to the public, and to future generations that the monarchy could not be swayed by individual ambition or media influence. Meanwhile, the palace legal team was consulted once more. They confirmed that the proposed action, while extreme, was legally defensible. Charles had the authority to revoke existing titles, particularly if doing so was framed as a response to procedural overreach or a breach of protocol. The legal framework was sound, the messaging had to be precise. And the palace communications team was already drafting statements designed to convey firmness, fairness, and historical continuity. As William prepared to implement his plan, his fury transformed into resolve. He recognized that this was a defining moment for the monarchy, one that could shape public perception for decades. It was also a deeply personal moment, a test of his ability to balance familial loyalty with institutional responsibility. Every decision, every word, every action mattered. Failure was not an option. The execution of the plan required precision. William coordinated with security, advisors, and communications staff, ensuring that the palace's response would be swift, controlled, and strategically timed. The goal was not to provoke Meghan unnecessarily, but to assert authority in a manner consistent with both legal precedent and royal tradition. Every detail was scrutinized, from the language of official statements to the timing of internal communications. As the plan unfolded, the tension in the palace grew palpable. Courtiers whispered anxiously, legal advisors double-checked every scenario, and security personnel maintained a vigilant watch. The stakes could not have been higher. And yet, even as William moved with strategic precision, there remained a question that haunted everyone present. How would Meghan react to this unprecedented show of force? Outside the palace, the world remained largely unaware of the unfolding drama. Social media buzzed with speculation. Tabloid journalists hinted at intrigue. But no one could anticipate the magnitude of what was about to occur within the palace walls. William understood this better than anyone. He knew that timing, presentation, and execution would determine not only the immediate impact, but also the historical legacy of this decisive moment. Then came the pivotal instant, the moment William decided to escalate. Sources indicate that he personally coordinated with security to ensure that Meghan's communications channels were monitored, that the timing of the palace's response was synchronized, and that every advisor understood their role in the unfolding action. It was meticulous, deliberate, and undeniably forceful, a demonstration of authority designed to leave no ambiguity. And yet, even as the strategy was executed with precision, emotional undercurrents ran deep. William reportedly struggled privately with the implications for his brother, Prince Harry. He recognized the personal fallout, the potential for family rifts, and the media narrative that could portray the action as heavy-handed. But his commitment to principle, tradition, and institutional integrity outweighed personal discomfort. The palace was now in motion. Legal pathways had been validated. Communications were prepared. Security measures were in place. The stage was set for an action that was historic in scope and unprecedented in execution. And while the public remained largely unaware, the internal dynamics of the royal family had shifted dramatically, with William at the center of the storm, steering the course with both fury and determination. But as the plan reached its critical juncture, a final, unexpected factor emerged. Something subtle but profound, a private message, a leak, or an unforeseen reaction that would complicate even William's meticulous strategy. It was a reminder that, in royal affairs, no plan is ever entirely secure, and that even the most calculated actions can be disrupted by forces both human and unpredictable. And in that moment, behind palace doors, William's decisive move, fueled by anger, strategy, and a sense of duty, was set to collide with Meghan's next action in ways no one could fully anticipate. The result would shake the palace, ignite global attention, and forever change the trajectory of this royal saga. Meghan Markle had been quiet, or at least, the palace thought she had been quiet. From afar, she appeared composed, living her life in California, managing her media presence, and navigating the world outside the monarchy with a practiced ease. But beneath that calm exterior, plans were brewing. Strategic, deliberate, and designed to challenge the authority of the palace in a way few could have predicted. The moment she learned of the palace's internal deliberations, Meghan understood the stakes. The request for new titles had not only been denied, it had triggered a chain of events leading to potential revocation of existing titles. It was unprecedented, audacious, and, from her perspective, unacceptable. The response would be swift, calculated, and public. Meghan's counterattack began quietly but methodically. She convened a private meeting with her closest advisors, legal experts, media strategists, and communications professionals who had long managed her public image. The goal was clear: to challenge the palace's decision, protect her family, and reshape public perception. Every detail mattered. Every message, every public statement, every subtle leak had to be perfectly timed. The first move was legal. Meghan's attorneys began reviewing the palace's response, searching for weaknesses, ambiguities, or procedural missteps that could be leveraged. They examined historical precedent, dissected the legal framework governing royal titles, and explored avenues to question the fairness and legitimacy of any action taken against her or her children. The legal team knew that the stakes were enormous. Any miscalculation could backfire, giving the palace an even stronger foothold. Simultaneously, Meghan's media strategists prepared a narrative. The plan was to frame the palace's actions as punitive, rigid, and out of touch with modern values. Interviews were lined up, subtle leaks to sympathetic journalists were coordinated, and social media accounts were primed to amplify the story. Every post, every interview snippet, every subtle hint of discontent was calculated to build public sympathy and pressure the palace indirectly. But Meghan's approach was not solely external. She also focused on internal channels. Sources suggest that she reached out discreetly to sympathetic allies within the royal network, individuals who could influence decision-making subtly or provide insights into the palace's next moves. These communications were encrypted, precise, and strategic, evidence of a campaign that was as sophisticated as it was bold. The emotional component was critical. Meghan framed the issue as one of family, love, and maternal responsibility. She emphasized that Archie and Lilibet were innocent parties, deserving of recognition and protection. Public messaging, carefully crafted, highlighted fairness, compassion, and the moral imperative to honor her children's place in the family. The strategy was clear: combine legal pressure with public perception to create a dual-front challenge that the palace would find difficult to counter. Within days, the impact was already noticeable. Journalists began reporting on tensions within the royal family. Opinion pieces speculated about the Sussexes' next moves. Social media amplified the narrative, portraying Meghan as a determined mother fighting for her children against an inflexible institution. The palace, which had sought to manage the situation discreetly, suddenly found itself on the defensive, not legally, but in the court of public opinion. Meanwhile, Prince William and King Charles monitored the situation closely. Every leak, every media story, every subtle shift in public perception was analyzed. Advisors emphasized that while the palace had legal authority, perception often dictated public acceptance. The challenge was clear: how to maintain authority, protect the monarchy's reputation, and manage a family dispute that had become global news. Meghan, however, seemed several steps ahead. Her campaign was multifaceted, combining law, media, and personal messaging in a coordinated effort that caught even seasoned palace staff off guard. Sources suggest that she understood the palace's vulnerabilities, including internal divisions, media sensitivity, and the delicate balance between legal authority and public perception. Every move she made was calculated to exploit these dynamics. And then came the most audacious element of her counterattack: direct communication with the press. Carefully orchestrated leaks revealed selective information about the palace's deliberations, framing the narrative as a clash between tradition and fairness. Headlines hinted at unprecedented tension, public sympathy began to shift, and the palace's control over the story was challenged in real time. But Meghan's strategy was not reckless. It was designed to provoke response, test limits, and force the palace to react without overcommitting. Legal challenges, media campaigns, and public narratives were timed to maximize leverage, creating pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Sources indicate that she monitored reactions closely, adjusting the strategy as new information emerged, always staying one step ahead of palace projections. At Buckingham Palace, the counterattack did not go unnoticed. Advisors, courtiers, and even members of the family recognized the sophistication and intensity of Meghan's approach. While the legal framework favored the monarchy, the combination of media pressure and public sympathy created a dynamic that was unprecedented. Every decision now carried heightened risk, not just institutionally, but emotionally, politically, and historically. Prince William, in particular, was infuriated. From his perspective, the counterattack was not just a challenge to authority. It was a deliberate provocation, a maneuver designed to manipulate public perception and undermine the monarchy. His frustration was compounded by the personal stakes: his own family's legacy, his father's authority, and the position of his nephews and nieces within the royal hierarchy. Yet, even in his fury, William understood that the response had to be measured, strategic, and legally sound. Impulsive retaliation could play into Meghan's hands, giving her further leverage. Behind the scenes, legal advisors scrambled to anticipate Meghan's next moves. They examined potential lawsuits, media strategies, and public relations countermeasures. Every word of the palace's forthcoming communications was debated, rewritten, and refined to withstand scrutiny. The goal was clear: assert authority, protect tradition, and mitigate the impact of Meghan's calculated offensive. As the situation escalated, the palace began preparing for the inevitable public reaction. Communication teams drafted statements emphasizing tradition, legal authority, and family responsibility, carefully balancing firmness with compassion. The narrative had to be precise, show that the monarchy was upholding centuries of protocol while acknowledging the human element of family dynamics. Any misstep could be exploited by Meghan's team, further intensifying the crisis. Yet, despite meticulous planning, uncertainty loomed. Meghan's counterattack had introduced variables that the palace had never faced before: global media scrutiny, coordinated social campaigns, sympathetic public opinion, and strategic legal maneuvers. Every action taken by the monarchy now risked escalation, and every response had to anticipate the next move. It was a delicate, high-stakes chess game where each piece represented not only protocol and tradition, but also personal ambition, family loyalty, and historical legacy. And then came the tipping point. A private communication from Meghan revealed that she intended to escalate further, potentially taking the matter beyond traditional legal channels and into a more public, confrontational sphere. This development sent a ripple of urgency through Buckingham Palace. Advisors recognized that the situation could no longer be managed passively. Decisive action was required, not just to protect titles, but to safeguard the monarchy itself. As preparations were made for the palace's next move, the tension reached its peak. Meghan's counterattack had shifted the balance, forcing the royal family into a reactive position. Every internal discussion, every legal memo, every carefully crafted message became a critical factor in what was rapidly becoming an unprecedented standoff. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would redefine the relationship between Meghan Markle and the monarchy. The palace was prepared to act. But Meghan had already taken the first strategic move, and her counterattack had the potential to reshape the entire narrative. And just as the palace prepared its response, a revelation arrived. Unexpected, explosive, and capable of changing everything. What it was no one could have anticipated. But it would push both Meghan and the royal family into uncharted territory, setting the stage for a historic showdown that would shock the world. The palace had remained patient. For weeks, behind the polished doors and golden corridors, Buckingham had weighed every scenario, analyzed every potential risk, and prepared for the inevitable. But patience has its limits. Meghan Markle's counterattack, the legal maneuvers, the media campaigns, the carefully orchestrated public narrative had shifted the balance, leaving the monarchy no choice but to act decisively. It began quietly. Advisors were summoned to a private chamber, communications teams drafted precise language, and security protocols were discreetly updated. Every step was calculated to assert authority without provoking unnecessary scandal. Yet the underlying message was clear. The monarchy would not be manipulated or intimidated. This was not just a response, it was a statement. King Charles, usually reserved, took the lead. Sources inside the palace describe him as focused, deliberate, and unyielding. The weight of history pressed on him. Every decision made in these chambers would echo for generations. Every word of the forthcoming communication was scrutinized, tested, and refined to ensure it balanced firmness with diplomacy. The stakes were unprecedented, and the tension in the room was palpable. Prince William played a central role. After Meghan's counterattack, he had insisted that the monarchy act swiftly and decisively. He argued that delaying would be interpreted as weakness, emboldening further challenges. His strategic mind, honed by years of navigating public scrutiny and media pressure, was critical in shaping the palace's next move. He advocated for a bold course, a comprehensive revocation of any titles, privileges, or ceremonial roles associated with Meghan and her children. The message had to be unmistakable. Tradition, hierarchy, and authority were non-negotiable. Legal advisors confirmed the feasibility. The revocation could be executed within the king's authority, framed as a response to procedural overreach and a challenge to royal protocol. The palace had precedent, rare, scattered, and historical, but enough to defend the action if questioned. Communications teams began drafting statements that emphasized legal authority, historical continuity, and the necessity of upholding the monarchy's integrity. Every word, every phrase, every nuance was designed to preempt criticism and minimize public backlash. Meanwhile, Meghan's team continued their campaign, unaware of the full scale of the palace's preparations. She believed she held the upper hand, confident in her media influence and the sympathetic narrative she had cultivated. But Buckingham was about to demonstrate that the monarchy, while slow and deliberate, could move decisively when challenged. The first phase of the palace's response involved legal formalities. Notices were drafted and prepared for delivery, outlining the revocation of titles and privileges. The language was precise, formal, and legally sound, leaving no room for ambiguity. It was a move that sent a clear message. The monarchy had authority, the law was on its side, and challenges would be met with decisiveness. Next came strategic communication. The palace understood the importance of narrative. In the age of social media, leaks, and instant global reporting, the message had to be controlled and authoritative. Press briefings were prepared, historical context was provided, and public statements were carefully timed to ensure maximum clarity and impact. The goal was to assert authority while maintaining an image of fairness, even in the face of unprecedented challenges. Security and protocol were also tightened. Sources report that palace staff were briefed extensively, ensuring that all personnel understood the sensitivity of the situation. No unauthorized information could leak, and every interaction with media or public-facing personnel was scrutinized. The palace was operating like a well-oiled machine, each component synchronized to execute a high-stakes maneuver that would reverberate across the globe. As preparations neared completion, tension reached its peak. Advisors whispered anxiously, legal teams double-checked every scenario, and Charles and William conferred in private. They knew that once the action was taken, the consequences would be immediate and irreversible. Every decision had to be precise, every message carefully calibrated, every move intentional. The palace had reached a moment of no return. And then, the moment arrived. The palace issued its formal response. Titles, privileges, and ceremonial roles were revoked for Meghan Markle, Archie, and Lilibet. The legal justification was articulated clearly, emphasizing adherence to protocol, the maintenance of hierarchical integrity, and the protection of the monarchy's long-standing traditions. It was historic, unprecedented, and definitive, a royal decree that left no room for negotiation or ambiguity. The reaction was immediate. Media outlets worldwide reported the revocation, headlines blared across screens, and social media erupted. The palace had not only acted but also controlled the narrative, emphasizing legality, tradition, and authority. The message was unmistakable. The monarchy was sovereign, unyielding, and capable of decisive action in the face of challenge. Yet the human element remained. The decision impacted family dynamics profoundly. Prince Harry was reportedly furious. Meghan prepared her next move, and even senior advisors acknowledged the emotional toll of such an unprecedented action. While the palace had acted with strategic precision, the personal fallout was unpredictable, creating a tension that would continue to unfold in the days and weeks ahead. As the world reacted, the palace remained focused. Communication teams monitored media coverage, legal advisors prepared for potential challenges, and Charles and William continued to coordinate their response. They understood that this was not the end. It was the beginning of a complex, high-stakes chapter in the royal family's history. And just when it seemed the palace had secured its authority, a sudden, unexpected development occurred. A private message, leak, or unforeseen reaction from Meghan emerged, threatening to escalate the situation further. The monarchy, despite its meticulous planning, now faced a challenge that could test the limits of its authority, patience, and strategic foresight. The palace had struck back decisively, but the battle was